Welcome back to NewsX. I'm Joshua Barnes and you're watching Focal Length, where we get you a briefing on topics from across the world. In this episode, we examine the unfolding complexities in the Middle East and beyond, with Germany, the US, the UK and France opening diplomatic channels with their HTS regime in Syria. Can this move pave the way for democracy? Meanwhile, tensions escalate as Turkey targets Kurdish forces in Syria, and Iran's regional influence comes under scrutiny. On the Israel-Hamas front, amid the stalled hostage negotiations, what is the possibility of a breakthrough? Joining us is Michael Rubin. He is a prominent American historian and policy analyst specialising in Middle Eastern affairs. He is currently the Director of Policy Analysis at the Middle East Forum. He has served as a staff advisor on Iran and Iraq for the Office of the Secretary of Defence. Rubin authored several influential books. Thank you, Michael Rubin, for joining us. My first question to you is, Germany, the US, the UK and France have opened diplomatic channels with the HTS regime in Syria. How optimistic are you that HTS, a designated terrorist organisation formally, can ensure democracy in Syria?
I'm absolutely positive that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, will not truly reform. What's going on here now is all about the money. There's going to be multiple billions of dollars, maybe $7 billion that the United Nations is proposing to spend on Syria's reconstruction after its years of civil war. If HTS is recognized as the government, HTS will have the power over that money and, of course, will siphon much of it off. Also remember, HTS was designated a terrorist group for a reason. They were affiliated with Al-Qaeda. Perhaps the difference between Al-Qaeda and a reformed Al-Qaeda group is that while Al-Qaeda beheads Christians and other minorities, a reformed Al-Qaeda group only tortures them and doesn't behead them. It's not a distinction which I think we should be comfortable with.
Could legitimising HTS in Syria lead to a resurgence of ISIS in the region?
I believe that HTS's victory is a benefit to the Islamic State, and the reason is this. HTS is a proxy of Turkey. It's not clear if they're going to be able to free themselves from Turkey's agenda. Most of the Islamic State prisoners are at a prison called Al-Hol, which is out in northeastern Syria. Thousands of the Islamic State prisoners and their family members, because remember, many of the Islamic State fighters married people when they were out there. Their home countries from which they initially came won't allow them to come back. And the Kurds are guarding this prison. Turkey's agenda number one, and it's an agenda which Ahmed Shara has sworn on to. Ahmed Shara, the leader of HTS, is to defeat the Kurds, defeat the Kurdish militias. Now, I've been in northeastern Syria, and the description of the Kurdish militias that we often hear from the Turks is absolute nonsense. Turkey says that they're just an offshoot of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, and they say that the entire region is simply a terrorist entity. There hasn't been any terrorist attacks that Turkey has been able to prove have originated from northeastern Syria. Most of what the Kurds do in northeastern Syria is get the schools running and protect all the religious minorities. If Turkey starts bombing the Kurds, either they're going to have to divert people from guarding the prison, or Turkey's simply going to allow the prisoners to be released. This is going to be a win for Turkey for two reasons. Number one, Turkey ideologically sympathizes with the Islamic State. Number two, Turkey can use the Islamic State prisoners which have escaped as blackmail to Europe, threatening to allow them to move onward to Europe, or for that matter, the southern border of the United States, unless people cave to Recep Tayyip Erdogan's demands. Now, some people go to Turkey and say Turkey doesn't feel like the Islamic State. But the analogy that one should take with Turkey is to Pakistan. Pakistan, ever since the liberation, the independence of Bangladesh, has embraced radical Islamism, much more for abroad than even at home. And Turkey is taking the same strategy. They're embracing radical Islamism, jihadism, for export, not realizing, like in Pakistan, it always comes back to burn the country that sponsors it. And so Turkey is going to suffer the backlash. HTS, unfortunately, isn't independent. HTS is to Turkey what Hezbollah is to Iran.
How does the United States plan to address Turkish attacks on Kurdish forces within Syria?
That's the open question many people in Washington are discussing. Both the United States and Israel are giving some rhetorical support, but it's not clear that the United States is prepared to do anything militarily. And within the Trump administration, there's actually a fierce argument behind the scenes between those who are pro-Turkey and versus those who are pro-Kurdish. Perhaps the Turkey issue is one of the issues where there's the most dissent within the Trump administration. But basically what's happened is Turkey has maximized the opportunity of the timing, because the United States right now, of course, is between administrations. Joe Biden, if I may, is clinically senile. He's not really in control of anything, and Erdogan knows that he can push as far as he can until January 20th. Now, as far as Donald Trump is concerned, he doesn't understand the value of American forces inside Syria, even though many of the people in the Pentagon and the incoming Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, do. And so you're going to have a situation in which Recep Tayyip Erdogan is going to try to conquer as much as he can before January 20th, hoping that Donald Trump won't act. But let's face it, Donald Trump is a wild card. No one knows how he's going to react.
Has Iran's influence on the region diminished significantly?
Yeah, I mean, certainly Iran's stronghold in the region has diminished. Iran no longer has as much power to supply Hezbollah, and Iran doesn't have the power the ally it once had in Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria. But it's too soon to close the book on this, simply because Ahmed al-Shara may, or other factions within Syria, may seek advantage from Iran. Iran isn't going to give up easily. It's going to be difficult for Iran to maintain the supply and the support it has for the Houthis in Yemen. And so that's going to continue to impact shipping, including Indian shipping. But within Iraq, I would expect Iran to double down. And when we look at the leadership, if you will, of the global Shiite jihad, previously it was Ayatollah Khomeini. Khomeini died. It doesn't, even though there's a succession, the leadership doesn't really necessarily coincide with the designated succession because it takes charisma. It takes reputation in order to have this leadership. So Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force, basically took over this leadership. He was a charismatic figure, perhaps even the second most popular figure inside the Islamic Republic of Iran. But Donald Trump, of course, had him killed on January 3rd, 2020. Someone else was appointed in his place, Ismail Qani, but Ismail Qani was rather colorless. So the real leadership of the jihad went to Saeed Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, until Israel killed him most recently. Now, there's someone new in Hezbollah, Qasem Naim, but that person doesn't really have the leadership. The real leadership of Iran's axis of resistance, if you will, is probably Qais Khazali, who is the head of Saif Ali al-Haq, one of these terrorist groups, militant groups inside Iraq. I would expect that Iran is going to double down on Iraq, and that we need to worry about what this relatively young man, this 45-year-old or so, named Qais Khazali, is going to do as he tries to rally his forces and radicalize them. And that's going to be a problem, not only for the Middle East into the next years, but it will also be a problem for South Asia and India as well.
With Israel and Hamas blaming each other for delays in a hostage deal, do you see a realistic chance of any deal being reached?
I'm doubtful. First of all, make no mistake, Hamas is a designated terrorist group. Israel is a democratic state. And it's wrong to create, for negotiators, to create moral equivalence between these two. Israel has said from the very beginning that if Hamas releases its hostages, women, civilians, that the war would end immediately. It's that simple. I mean, should Canada negotiate with Khalistani terrorists? Should India negotiate with Harakat al-Mujahideen or Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent? The answer to that is an absolute no. The forces of the West, the forces of liberal democracy, India, the United States, Europe, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Australia, we all need to stand together. And Israel, like Ukraine and like Taiwan, are on the front lines. And for that matter, India, when it comes to occupied portions of Kashmir, as well as Arunachal Pradesh, are on the front lines in the battle against autocracy and revanchism. All these countries need to stand together. But look, in answer to your question, Hamas knows that the second they give up the hostages, they become irrelevant because they've already become militarily defeated. And in that case, I don't see Hamas giving up the hostages willingly. They're going to need to be killed to the last terrorist.
President-elect Donald Trump has portrayed himself as a key negotiator for peace between Hamas and Israel. Do you think he has the ability to succeed in brokering said deal?
No. Look, the difference between Donald Trump and many of his predecessors is many of his predecessors never give up on diplomacy. Donald Trump will try diplomacy. For example, we saw this with North Korea. But if the diplomacy doesn't seem to be working, he'll simply walk away. Hamas is an ideological enemy, much like North Korea. And therefore, I don't think Hamas is going to be serious about negotiations. Donald Trump is going to see that. Certainly, Marco Rubio will see that, the incoming Secretary of State. And therefore, I expect that Donald Trump might reach out. But then it's simply he's simply going to walk away. He's not going to appear desperate like Joe Biden or Barack Obama have.
Has immigration contributed to an increase in violence and terror attacks in Europe and across the United States?
Yes, absolutely. I think it has. Look, immigration is a net positive, but two things are being ignored. First of all, immigrants need to contribute to the society in which they're coming. And in this case, for example, I think the United States should have lots of immigrants. But I think basically the United States should have lots of Indian immigrants because India contributes to our tech sector. Indians contribute to other high-tech sectors as well, to computing and so forth, to our science. Indians have become the backbones of so many US universities. If Indians want to leave India, I'm willing to accept as many educated Indians as possible to bolster the American economy. The other issue, however, is when immigrants come, they really do need to assimilate. If you're a gang member in El Salvador and you're coming to the United States to be a gang member here, that should be unacceptable. If you come from an autocracy, let's say you come from Syria and you deeply hate the state of Israel, or you come from Pakistan, another autocracy, and you deeply hate India, well, the reason why your country is in ruins is because of your irrational hatred. So don't bring it to the United States. What we need to do is have immigration, but also time it so that immigrants can integrate as much as possible. That said, let me put it this way. The United States has less of a problem than Europe does because the United States does do a better job of embracing immigrants. Muslims in the United States have a higher on average per capita income than other Americans. Hindu Americans do too, for that matter. The fact of the matter is, while racism exists in the United States, we talk about it and we do things about it. It's much more deep-seated in Europe, and that's why we see some of the attacks like we most recently saw in Germany. because many of the immigrants aren't being assimilated. They feel deeply frustrated. They're not being listened to. There's a glass ceiling. And therefore, they're just becoming isolated and extremely violent. If I may, the last problem is when we bring in men without families, men without women, that ultimately creates a problem. It's no coincidence that 70 or 80% of the immigrants coming into Europe on boats across the Mediterranean from Africa or from Turkey or through the Belarusian forest, they're men and they're unmarried. They have few prospects when they get there, and then they turn to violence. I mean, ultimately, we need to recognize that if only young men are coming, then probably the problem isn't simply the economy, it's something else.
Thank you, Michael Rubin, for speaking to us on Focal Length. With that, it's a wrap on this episode. For more international news updates, stay tuned on NewsX.